Hello and welcome to Carbon Removal Newsroom. I'm Ross Kenyon, lead strategist with the Nori Carbon Removal Marketplace. Today I have with me multiple Nori colleagues. It's been a tough week for everyone, hard to schedule, a lot on everyone's mind. So thank you so much for being here. Today I have Alessandra Guerra, Director of Corporate Development at Nori.
Hello.
Hey, Alessandra. Melina White, who I've been calling you, a moonlighting marketer. Is that okay for you, Melina?
That sounds wonderful for me. Hi, Russ.
Hi. And Alden Donnelly, Director of Carbon Economics at Nori.
Hey Ross,
Alden.
how are you?
I am doing well. So let's go through this outline and give listeners a chance to know what we're going to talk about today. Melina and I did a bonus episode of Reversing Climate Change about Black Lives Matter, climate justice, and carbon removal. So we're going to go back through some of that. Melina has some updates she wanted to share. We wanted to talk about Climeworks. They just closed a 73 million Swiss francs financing round. The Savory Institute and Timberland have a new partnership around regenerative leather for a new line of boots. The last thing we want to talk about, too, is there are new rules for 45Q or new guidance from the Treasury Department. So, Alden, we're going to give you a chance to explain what exactly that means for the carbon removal industry at large. So, yeah, why don't we just kick it off here at the top? Melina, I know you had some stuff you wanted to talk about with regard to Black Lives Matter and movement on that front.
Yes, Ross. So just kind of following up to what I thought was a really great constructive conversation we had the other day. Towards the end of the podcast, we shared some of the solutions that you and I have been reading about and think can deliver real change to some of the issues, key issues that the protests have been around here in the United States and really at this point globally, daily peaceful protesting that's happening. And so one thing I wanted to share with everyone was an organization that's really starting to build momentum since the protests began, and that's Campaign Zero. So Campaign Zero is this nonpartisan organization that is trying to deliver what they describe as data-driven solutions to help, first, most importantly, is reduce and in some ways eliminate violent interactions with police in the community and bring policing back to a community type model where, again, police officers are living, working, and relating to the people who they've vowed to protect and serve. And it's pretty cool what they've come up with. Their main solutions are around these 10 things. And what's great is you can take those 10 elements and compare it to your local police department and say, okay, is my local police department practicing any of these 10 elements? Is there something that I can do, bring to my local city council, local city leaders to see how we can get closer to that 10? So some of the things that they've mentioned, again, and they've got a lot of data on their website that helps to support how these methods produce results, is first off, ending the broken windows policy, policing, community oversight, limit use of force, independently investigate and prosecute cases involving police, community representation in the police force, body cams on police, training, and that's a big part of training around de-escalation, which I mentioned the other day, and for-profit policing, demilitarization, and fair police union contracts. So these are 10 things that you can help push in your local community, which again shows through their data to deliver really great results. And one campaign that's a part of Campaign Zero that's really been getting shared around social media this week is what they call #8Can'tWait. And it's 8 elements that they've come up with that can help to greatly reduce police violence immediately. In fact, by their measure, it would decrease police violence by 72%. So if you look up #8Can'tWait on social media, you can learn a little bit more about it. Or to learn about the entire campaign, you can go to joincampaignzero.org. And again, I think they've got some great solutions. It's a nonpartisan movement and very timely right now.
Links to that is in the show notes, or to both of those things are in the show notes right now. I'm curious what, especially Alessandra and Alden, what you both think about what will happen to the carbon removal field in general. I'm not sure there's been that many climate justice discussions always within carbon removal as an industry specifically. I imagine we'll see quite a bit more of that. And I think there are also things that you can do as a company or an organization. I know we tend to think about this as we're growing the team. How do we do so in an equitable manner? And I watch pretty closely Carbon 180's various internal policies for HR for how they are doing so in an equitable way. So I don't know, how are you both thinking about this?
Well, I think it's a whole new time for how we do business. And before, I mean, we saw a growing, an increase of people or companies making commitments to the environment. And I also expect that they'll be making more increased commitments to, I don't know, having good business, having more justice in their supply chain, being more equitable and fair. And I think it's a completely new way of doing business. That makes me somewhat hopeful for the future, because if we don't, then everything's just going to be siloed, and we're going to be forgetting that there are actual impacts to everything, the way that we're operating, the way that we're procuring our supplies, etc.
I share Alexandra's optimism, but with a little more caution. I am worried because I think we can see in this crisis what the value of education is, and in this new economy that's going to emerge out of this crisis, I think it's going to be hard as ever for people who haven't enjoyed the benefits of a great education to succeed. So I'm hoping that we find a way to bridge that gap. I hope we start seeing all sorts of training programs being launched, and it's going to have to be by corporations because government's not going to have the money. But you know, I'm an old lady. I'm 65, and when I was in my 20s and first going to work, corporations had very well developed and intensive training programs, and that fell away over the decades. And I really hope to see that coming back, because I think that's going to be essential.
Why do you think that fell away, Alden? Because I'm very curious. It seems like with this Impact Zero, or I might have called it the wrong name, that it's about community involvement. And so if we had that before with corporations, why don't we now?
I don't really know the answer to that question, though. You know, for many decades after the Second World War, a much higher proportion of the cities and towns in North America, not just North America, were what we used to call company towns. So there was a time when companies were more identified with the communities in which they had their principal operations, and there was much more of a connection. Back in those days, if you were racing sailboats on the weekend, the local lumber company probably lent all their radios to you, and that sort of thing just doesn't happen anymore. And the training, the commitment to employee training and continuing education, I think was part of that. We've got to get it back.
Well, fair enough. That sounds like a bigger conversation too. In other news, as one says when one is hosting a news program, Climeworks seemingly will not stop getting news, since we talked about them last week with regard to Stripe's negative emissions purchases. They're doing interesting work with Lufthansa in producing jet fuel from captured carbon. And now we see that they just did a 93 million Swiss franc financing round. So big stuff coming out of Switzerland, it looks like.
Yeah. Was it 93 million? I thought it was 73 million.
I said 73, didn't I?
You said 93.
Oh, okay.
Climeworks was 93, so just go with it.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm staring right at it. I don't know how that happened. Yeah, 73 million Swiss francs.
Yeah, I think it's the biggest private investment that's ever gone, or private round ever raised for direct air capture. 75 million. 73 million Swiss francs, 75 million US dollars.
Yeah, sorry, just get that conversion right. Yeah.
I got to say, good on them. And when it comes to direct air capture, I'm a fan of their technology. I am a little bit cautious about all of this, though, because for the most part, the CO2 that's going to be drawn down with that technology is going to be processed and then almost immediately re-released to the atmosphere in modern fuels. So on the one hand, it's a really good story in that they're displacing a certain amount of fossil fuel use. On the other hand, it's not permanent CO2 drawdown for the most part. It's technology that can be used for that purpose, but the investment that is flowing to direct air capture is primarily interested in recycling the CO2 into next generation liquid fuels. So it's a good story, but the incremental emission impact isn't going to be as large as the potential for that technology is.
The classic counter argument to this too, or maybe it's just if you zoom out a little bit, that this technology may port over very nicely to more carbon removal specific activities that would appeal to you in their storage capabilities. So it might start with something that's closer to carbon neutral or fuels that are less damaging to the environment. But it won't always just be that, right? Some of this technology will accelerate carbon removal in general, even if it's not being applied for something that is truly storing the carbon dioxide that is captured, right?
I totally agree with that. I also think the innovation that the direct air capture industry is bringing to us will end up getting incorporated in carbon capture and storage, and there will be a new generation of technology that will be way more cost effective and better over time because of the innovation we're seeing coming out of companies like Climeworks. So it's there's a future there that I'm really excited about. I just want to get there faster.
Yeah.
So, Alden, I'm curious, what do you think it's going to take for a company that's truly doing a carbon capture method, a truly carbon negative method to get that $75 million private equity investment to really, accelerate their ability to scale in the world?
I can't speak for the investors. I think and I'm struggling here because one of the things we're not talking about while we're repeatedly talking about Climeworks is Enhance in Canada. And so just 2 months ago, a project went operational that has attracted about 800 million in private investment, so significantly more than Climeworks. And as of March 2020, the emissions from Nutrien's big fertilizer plant in Alberta and the emissions from a big diesel refinery are being captured and injected back into the ground to enhance oil recovery rates. So there's still not even a carbon neutrality there, but that project is starting injecting 1.6 million tons a year and has the full build-out capacity to be injecting 14 million tons a year. So it's attracted 10 times the capital investment that Climeworks has attracted and has a much larger, more significant sequestration potential. So I'm saying that I love to see the capital running in both directions. I think all of the investors, again, are not just attracted to what the technology can do today, but what they think the next iterations of both technologies looks like. And I think it's that investment in innovation that's going to pay out for us more than what either of those projects are doing right now.
I think there's something at the heart of all of the questions of, where do we invest our money when it comes to carbon removal, whether it's ecological or industrial, which is permanence. You said the word permanent, Alden, and my ears just perked, and it just reminded me of, what happened with Stripe. And I won't go too much into it because I know you've already done an episode on this, Ross, but Stripe's main motivation let's start back. They started off wanting to, give $1 million to carbon dioxide removal initiatives. And they were looking across the board from natural to industrial. And then in the end, they decided, okay, we're only going to invest in industrial because they wanted to have permanence of over 1,000 years of storage. So what's interesting is like, yes, direct air capture can sequester and store carbon over long periods of time, but if you're using it for enhanced oil recovery, or if you're putting it into fuels, like that permanence becomes like an issue. It's not necessarily permanent, because you're going to be emitting CO2 ultimately at the end of the process. And that's not to be like, oh, this is not a good thing, it's not helpful. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. It's the trickiest issue I see in the space of carbon removal is the issue of permanence, and like coming up with a standard, like an index of what exactly is permanent, because something that's permanent for, regenerative grazing or regenerative agriculture or afforestation is going to be different than direct air capture for synthetic fuels, or direct air capture that goes into carbonates. And so having a standard to talk about permanence, I think, is the most useful thing for us to start to compare apples and oranges.
I think you make very good points, Alexandra, and permanence is a bit of a sticky issue from my perspective, and I actually don't want to make this too much Nori promotion, but I think Nori so far has got that question right. I'll tell you where my issue is with the concept of permanence. Totally agree that if we're giving enterprises credit for pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, the objective is that carbon removal be permanent. But we also live in a world where every oil company that gets a license to drill oil signs a contract that commits that company, when they stop producing oil, to cap and cap that oil well so that it's not releasing pollution or emissions after it stops producing oil. And a very large share, or a significant share, of those oil wells end up being owned by corporate entities that declare bankruptcy when they stop producing oil, and they become abandoned wells. And that's our current long-term version of so we have a long history of corporate commitments to deliver on the environment, and I would consider that sort of an analogy to permanence. And I'm not confident, even if permanent agreements are being signed today by corporations who are perfectly well-intended and are doing everything right, I'm not confident 30 years from now, when the third generation of owner of that obligation declares bankruptcy and the permanence commitment is gone, that we're going to be happy with how we approach that question right now. In Nori, what we've said is 1 NRT is an incremental ton of CO2 drawn out of the atmosphere and retained under a contractual arrangement for at least 10 years. And we did that on purpose, because if someone wants to buy reductions that are equivalent to permanent, which is 100 years worth of CO2, then we're trying to communicate buy 10 Nori NRTs, 10 times 10 years. And don't assume that for payment of, for a series of payments over 10 years, a landowner of any sort is actually going to find they have the capacity to guarantee that carbon stock will be maintained for 100 years. Unless that carbon that's drawn out of the atmosphere is almost immediately mineralized, that's not a commitment we can place confidence in. I don't think we should be building our business model around commitments that we can't place confidence in.
This is exactly the kind of carbon removal banter I think our listeners want to geek out on. So thanks for doing that. All right, I'm going to use my prerogative as the host here to scoot us along. I'm not sure how long these episodes will be in the future. That's something that we should look into what people want. But let's scoot it along and see how it goes. One of the other stories that we singled out this week is that the Savory Institute and Timberland have a new partnership around regenerative leather for a new line of boots. First question, when can I get a pair? Second question, how exactly does this work? What is happening right now with regenerative grazing? And it looks like procurement is happening with some products that are coming out of this specific approach.
I'm hesitating to jump in because I'm ready to so much airtime.
Well, maybe actually, Alden, before maybe you jump in, I think it's let's start off with like what exactly is regenerative grazing, and how is that different from typical grazing?
Regenerative grazing can involve a whole bunch of things, but it's where the operator manages the grasslands to it's really timing and movement. So the key part of regenerative grazing is instead of having livestock all in one place and delivering them feed and having them basically destroy a patch of ground, you rotate your livestock in cycles. You're tracking what's happening in the soil, and you can actually turn grazing livestock on the land from extractive or regenerative practice to an extractive practice to a regenerative practice by shifting as soon as they've maximized the value of their excrement on a certain patch of land, and before they've depleted the soil of its complete plant surface, looking for food, you move them. So it's just pure, very conscious rotations of the livestock is really, really useful. And also being very attentive to what kind of grasses are being grown on the land. And in many cases, when you're looking at land that has been seriously dehydrated, as often due to fires and pest infestations, not necessarily livestock impacts, opportunities to rebuild the carbon stocks and biomass and soil health and moisture retention in those grasslands can be huge, really, really huge.
It's a pretty good summation. Are you happy with that, Alessandra?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense.
Well, I know you're doing it for the benefit of the listener, but I think that's fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Now the other side of it, it's difficult enough to develop verifiable estimates of changes in soil organic carbon stocks as they relate to cropping practice changes. It's more difficult to really monitor and prove your outcomes in grasslands. Point Blue has a group of scientists who are doing really great work in that area. I love what Pasture Map is trying to do. And there's a couple of large corporations, not just, and I like what Patagonia is doing, not just Patagonia, who are really working hard at getting the science of soil organic carbon estimation in grasslands right. And I think we're going to see some very, very interesting breakthroughs in the next 12 months. It's going to be really exciting.
Breakthroughs like what?
I think we're going to see some very, very good combinations of uses of drone-borne sensors and satellite imaging that's going to enable livestock producers to be more responsive in real time to changes in the above ground biomass and soil carbon stocks, and they're going to be able to very, very precisely work on livestock yield and rotations, and I think we're very close to a really good place there.
Well, from a consumer point of view, learning about this partnership really gets me excited, because I think, over the last almost 20 years now, I think that businesses have been able to really educate people about food systems, where their food is coming from. 20 years ago, maybe 2% of the American population had ever went and purchased organic food. And now organic, natural, non-GMO food is a really big part of a lot of people's everyday diet, and they seek out those products. But it hasn't made its way to the fashion industry yet. We know that fast fashion is a huge issue, and not only does it have an impact on communities, on people, but it also has a huge negative impact on the planet. And so seeing companies like Timberland, that's a huge fashion company, and reaches people who maybe never once thought about how their clothing or shoe purchase impacts the climate, impacts the environment. This is a first step in really starting to educate people and making them aware that the clothing you choose does make a difference, does have an impact. And also just educating people about regenerative agriculture, So I think most have never even heard of it before. So overall, even if there are some flaws there, I think this is an excellent move forward for the industry.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot about Allbirds, where I think, yeah, well, Melina and Ross have talked about
love
Allbirds.
Allbirds.
Meanwhile, I was
It's like my regular sneaker.
I
Yeah.
have to plug my friend Mike. I was on the phone with him last night, and he works at Allbirds, and he was talking about some great things that they're doing over there right now.
Yeah, and it's so funny. Like I was in the middle of looking for new running shoes, and now I bought Allbirds because I don't know if Instagram heard me talking to you about Allbirds, but all of a sudden I'm getting like advertised, and I can go to their website and I can see just if you scroll through the bottom of the product description for each shoe, 9 kilograms of CO2 was emitted for the shoe, and we offset the rest, and we try to use renewable materials. They use wool, etc. And they have this whole story about it. And this is what I'm imagining Timberland is now trying to do with their leather. It's like, we're not just like killing cows and making leather out of them. Like we're doing this holistic approach where we're storing the land, the soil, and drawing down CO2, treating cows properly, etc. And I'm like, okay, this is great. If this is like, and it was so funny. My grandfather, I live with my grandparents right now, and he says to me, "How much did you pay for those shoes?" And I told him. And he goes, I don't understand. He's like, normal people are not going to buy those shoes. And I was like, my generation is, because we care. We will pay the extra dime or the extra $100 for the story, and for me to like wear my shoes and feel.
One
really,
of my
really
father's favorite sayings is "Pay me now or pay me later," and that's how I look at things like that. You can invest now, or we can have the negative repercussions on society and on the planet later. No matter what, we're going to pay.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
I'm wondering what it looks like to educate consumers about holistic management and regenerative grazing, because I don't think that's on most people's radars yet. It seems like it just has less awareness than even regenerative agriculture, specifically croplands. But maybe that stuff happens faster than I think. I don't know that I've ever thought about how long it takes to educate a consumer base about something like that. But maybe it happens relatively quick. Does anyone know?
I think. Sorry.
I mean, like you.
Sounds like everybody knows. Yeah.
I think the whole question of grazing or its livestock production is complicated, and I don't think anybody's done yet painted a picture that helps. So there are so many different ways to consider this, and one extreme is don't eat meat, don't buy leather, and the other extreme is, gee, if you think about it, if you raised a cow the right way and you made sure that every part of the cow was put to use, the leather, the meat, every part of it, you could describe that whole area as either the worst thing in the world for the environment or the best thing in the world for the environment. And I don't think we've done a good job of just looking at the picture and finding a middle ground and then communicating it to the consumer.
Well, that sounds like a good place to leave it for now. Does anyone have anything else that they want to say about that?
Well, I think the one thing I want to say about that is like we just need to continue to talk about it. I think everything starts small somewhere, and then more and more people will talk or care about something, and it becomes more of the topic of conversation at, let's say, the dinner table. So hopefully people will become more aware of how food is being grown and impacting our overall climate, and understand it. Like if you bring up regenerative agriculture at the bar, hopefully more people will know what it is. And you can start by just talking about regenerative agriculture at the bar whenever bars open again. And that was really gloom, but yeah.
Okay, well, I know this has already been a bit of the Alden show, but sorry, I guess this is going to be a trend that continues for this episode. Alden, what happened with 45Q? And now there's new guidance from the Treasury Department around it. Can you catch people up on what 45Q is, what's happened since it's been announced, and what is happening now?
So 45Q is a section in the U.S. federal budget. And 45Q was first introduced in 2008, and it was it allows there to be a regulation that creates a tax credit. Originally, it was totally focused on a tax credit for projects installing carbon capture and storage technology on power plants. And it's been modified a number of times, and then it was significantly modified in 2018 and 19 under the Trump administration. And basically, if you, as of 2018, if you install carbon capture and storage on a power plant, a gas-fired or coal-fired power plant, or you do what Climeworks is doing, this came in 2019, and directly draw CO2 out of the atmosphere and inject it permanently into an underground reservoir, or use it to enhance oil recovery rates, or otherwise the word they use is utilize it, you can get a tax credit. And the tax credit on its face looks pretty big. It's being phased in over time, but by 2026, there are two different values. If you permanently store the CO2 that you either captured from a gas plant or a power plant and inject it in the ground, that tax credit right now is around $22.50 a ton and goes up to $50 a ton by 2026. And if you use that CO2 to inject in oil wells and increase the amount of oil you're pulling out of any well, that's called enhanced oil recovery, or EOR. That tax credit is right now around just under $13 a ton, and by 2026 would be $35 a ton. The tax credit, when it was introduced, has one set of rules for projects that were not built until after February 2018, and another set of rules for projects that were built before 2018. And I get depressed by that sort of stuff, so I made a point of trying not to pay too much attention to the details. But the scandal was the auditor decided just in the last year that about $1.1 billion worth of tax credits that have been claimed under 45Q, mostly with respect to projects that were constructed prior to 2018, were fraud. And I'm not exactly sure what the final number is. Last time I checked, the IRS had recovered 598 million of that 1.1 billion, and I don't know if their intent is to get the whole 1.1 billion back, but they've recovered more than half of it already. And that's kind of sad when that sort of stuff happens. Right now, and it's really coincidental, it's not as a result of the finding of fraud. The IRS is in a new regulation proposing some changes to the rule to make it more accessible to different projects, and they're inviting the public to read the rule and make comment over the next about 50 days. And I like a lot of the signals in 45Q, but it still doesn't go where those in the food and fiber industry need it to go. So basically the rule distinguishes between your carbon capture technology or your industrial process and utilization of the CO2. So under the existing rule, even with the new changes that are supposed to make it more hospitable, if Climeworks, for example, draws CO2 out of the atmosphere and pumps that CO2 into a greenhouse, and the greenhouse makes tomatoes and cucumbers, they qualify for the tax credit, the $35 version. So the CO2 is pulled out of the atmosphere with a whole bunch of fans that consume a whole bunch of electricity, is piped to a greenhouse, is sequestered in tomatoes and cucumbers, and then the carbon in the tomatoes and the cucumbers is mostly released back to the environment after those tomatoes and cucumbers are eaten. But if a farmer adopts regenerative practices and pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere and grows tomatoes and cucumbers and sequesters incremental carbon in the soil permanently, they don't qualify for the tax credit. So you get that I'm not a happy puppy. So basically, IRS has said, if you store the CO2 you've captured through the process of photosynthesis, you get the tax credit. But if you collect the CO2 you capture through the process of photosynthesis, you don't get the tax credit. You have to build some big industrial plant to get the tax credit, to collect the CO2. Now, at $35 a ton, US crop producers could be drawing down 400 to 450 million tons a year and building up the soil organic carbon stocks and making a lot more tomatoes and cucumbers sustainably.
Is the reason for that, I know it's much easier to administer a program like this that deals with fewer recipients, especially ones that are much bigger, as opposed to many farmers or something like that. Or was it something that was more of a political deal that had to be cut in order for this to happen? Both, probably some other reasons too.
At the risk of attracting ire, I think it's just that the big companies whose businesses are big industrial, manufacturing processes are much more astute and dedicated lobbyists than the farm community. Farmers are too busy making food, producing food. And I don't think there's a political opposition to rewarding food and fiber producers for what they can do in this regard. I don't think their voice has been heard in Washington, D.C. in a sort of a coherent way. I hope we can find ways to help that along, because what food and fiber producers are doing with regenerative agriculture is exactly what is served the purpose that this tax credit was intended for. That's number one. And number two, we all admit that tracing and verifying that the carbon has been stored can be complicated. But in fact, if you read the regulation, it's no less complicated for the projects that are approvable under this bill than it is for farmers and food for farmers. So complication isn't the argument to not have food and fiber production in. They distinguish between, there's three, but I'll just focus on two steps in this process. One is, how are you drawing the CO2 down? And the second is, how is it being used? And right now, if it's being used in photosynthesis, you get the tax credit as long as photosynthesis wasn't the process for drawing the CO2 down. In other words, right now, the most cost-effective, best return on investment carbon drawdown and sequestration strategy does not qualify for the U.S. tax credit under 45Q.
Well, any concluding thoughts from anyone? I think we covered pretty good ground. Thanks for saving us on that topic, Alden, with your extreme erudition on tax policy. I think that the rest of us are holding our breaths, right?
Did everybody else just hang up on the podcast about 10 minutes ago?
You're busy taking notes.
No, this is why we asked you to be on. Yeah. Well, anything else anyone wants to bring up, or are you feeling pretty good about wrapping it up here?
Feels okay to me.
Yep, feels okay to me. Thank you.
Yeah, feels good.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing all of your thoughts. Links to various things mentioned are in the show notes. If you would like to follow up with any of the panelists, thanks for listening. Also, if you like the show, please rate and review us on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher. Tell your friends. You can drop us a note at podcast, singular, podcast @nori.com. This format is new. We're still experimenting with it. So if you have thoughts on it, you want us to change something, or you like what you're hearing, feel free to drop us a note. And thank you so much for listening.